The questions, when we get to the questions, okay? But we'll push on now to Paul. You can Paul Ingram, who will introduce himself.
I'll introduce myself
as soon as he gets back to the,
okay.
the camera.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Paul Ingram. I've been a member of the Green Party for 30 years and was active in Oxford, was co-leader of the City Council for the Greens back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then came here to London. I work as the Executive Director of the British American Security Information Council, focusing on nuclear weapons. That's my passion, it always has been. I feel quite clearly that there is a deep moral, spiritual, political reason for us to change course dramatically on nuclear weapons. I'm very clear where I sit on the issue. But my interest has been how to go beyond just knowing where I sit or being part of a political party that knows where it sits, to thinking about how to then translate that into action and change the situation. And by action, I don't mean just going on marches and waving placards. I mean actually achieving the change that I want to see. I thought that I would kick off describing where we are internationally on the issue before going on to talk about where we are on the domestic debate, which of course has changed quite a lot in the last few weeks. And then think a bit about how to pick up on these opportunities to change the way we think and act on nuclear weapons to actually get the change we're looking for, rather than get stuck in the binary yes-no debate that has got us nowhere so far. So the international situation has been changing ever since the end of the Cold War. There was a big reduction in the number of nuclear weapons deployed in the world in the 1990s as a direct result of the unfreezing of relations. But there was no real serious effort to move away from dependency on nuclear weapons. And I fundamentally believe that the failure to move away from that dependency on nuclear weapons causes the problem that we have with Russia today. It's not the only cause. There are other causes around our desire to try to turn Russia into an extreme capitalist state, which has turned it into an autocracy, and the way in which we ignore Russian sensibilities in that part of the world, and a whole host of other reasons. But the fact that the nuclear weapons, essentially the structures stayed in place, and we still have thousands of nuclear weapons deployed, a large number, perhaps about 2,000 on short notice to fire, that's within 15 minutes, still today, means, I think, that we're locked in systemically into a conflict. Now, this was recognised by Cold War warriors back in 2008 in a letter to the Wall Street Journal, which kicked off a new era in the issue around nuclear weapons, where even the pro-nuclear lobby was starting to realise that they couldn't keep a lid on this. Nuclear weapons would spread inevitably, and we would soon see them in the hands of non-state actors. The result of this was a big speech by President Obama soon after he became president, the new agreement with the Russians called the New START, and an action plan agreed in 2010 at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. It was all fake. It was fake because there was no serious intention to really address the issues underneath their possession of nuclear weapons. And at the very same time that President Obama, I believe quite honestly, but he wasn't really addressing the underlying issues. At the same time as agreeing these things, he was also agreeing to massive new investments in nuclear weapon systems, amounting to roughly $1 trillion over the next 30 years, investments. Russians have pumped huge amounts of new money into their nuclear weapon systems, and actually every country which is nuclear armed in the world today is busy now spending lots of money on new nuclear weapons. So the world is dividing at the moment between those that are investing, those that feel that they are under the umbrella of these nuclear weapon states, largely the United States, and those that are increasingly getting frustrated and restless about the situation. And it's that last group that have kicked off since 2010 a process of looking at the humanitarian dimensions, the consequences of nuclear weapon use, as a precursor to a movement that could lead to a call for a ban on nuclear weapons altogether. There's a big debate going on in my community as to how we relate to that, but the principle is clear, the principle is obvious. Moving on to the domestic debate, as I said at the start, I think we as a party are quite clear where we stand. I don't believe there's a single member of the Green Party that would support the renewal of Trident. But the trouble is that this debate is framed in two ways. One is it is framed in terms of parochial needs, which lead a large number of people to very simplistic answers. Any psychologist will tell you if you frame something in a positive negative way, then immediately the negative is disadvantaged. You're framing yourself as being against something rather than in favour of something, and you get into a state where people see it in terms of a binary. It's morality against realism. It's idealism against the real world. It's people who stand on streets with placards against people who have to make the difficult decisions every day to protect us. And in that framing, it's very clear to me that the British public will by and large side with the people who will make the difficult decisions on our behalf. So we have to reframe the debate. The first thing I think we do is we start to say, actually, these weapons are not only immoral, but they're actually useless. They're actually useless even for the purposes that they are claimed to work for. And they're useless in several different ways. Firstly, it's not always true that the biggest thing works best. If you're trying to fix a picture up on a wall, you don't use a sledgehammer. Or if you do, you might get the picture hook into the wall, but the wall itself will come down. Nuclear weapons are not credible in any circumstance, and I stress the word any, because they are just too big. They're too big that whatever the purpose that you would have to use them, you will destroy the purpose of using them. So bigness is not necessarily the best. If you want to use a tool, you generally use the right tool, not the biggest tool. If you want to do a job, use the right tool. If you look at the way military technology is developing, whether we like it or not, it's becoming things that are increasingly precise, targeted, small, having minimal casualties, or at least things that are not too obvious, and autonomous and distant. Nuclear weapons don't go in this sort of direction. The other thing about nuclear weapons is they're not actually terribly effective militarily. If you explode a bomb on a city, you kill millions of people, but you don't actually tend to get the military significant targets. Military significant targets tend to be spread over broad areas. So you have to use a lot of nuclear weapons. And when you use a lot of nuclear weapons, you kill even more people. Now, nobody has ever won a war by killing large numbers of bystanders. And I just to use an example, during the Second World War, we bombed Dresden, Hitler bombed London, and there was a lot of carpet bombing, and the carpet bombing that was aimed at particular military significant activities may have had some impact on the war, but I don't think that people in London were cowed or throwing the towel in the Second World War because London was bombed. It actually has the opposite effect. People's backbones are strengthened. They want revenge. It actually deepens opposition. So killing large numbers of civilians is not very effective when it comes to war. But the most important thing about nuclear weapons, about nuclear deterrence, is that it's a weak theory, but you apply the theory to the fact of nuclear weapons that cause huge damage, to the fact that this depends upon human psychology and human frailty, and you get a situation that is incredibly worrying. So much so that most of us actually don't want to turn our attention to it. So what we do is we kind of ignore it. Even those of us who are active ignore or can't actually face up to the fact that the consequences of relying upon a system that depends upon the reality of human psychology and the way we are prone to folly and failure is really extremely worrying. And I think this is the thing that we need to deploy more effectively in terms of our argument, which is we are all human beings, we are all prone to do stupid things. You just look at history to see that it's not just individual stupidity, it's nations that make stupid errors. And in that sort of situation, mixing that with nuclear weapons is a recipe sooner or later for mass suicide on a big scale. So I think we need to think about how we deploy these arguments around risk, around utility of nuclear weapons, around the way in which nuclear weapons have much more to do with status than they do about security, to start to demand that our security depends upon sorting out the nuclear mess we're in. And that's bigger than Trident. It's internationally. But if we are going to argue that it's time to get rid of Trident, I think we have to argue on the basis that this is the most secure thing to do. This is the responsible thing to do. This is the thing to do if you are to provide leadership internationally. We as a country have provided leadership in the past, we're not providing leadership now. Instead, we're driven by cynicism, fear and power. And that is irresponsible. So if we cloak this in terms of responsibility, then we start to undermine the pillars that support nuclear deterrence in this country. Because we face a choice. We either continue to go down the route of renewing Trident and we maintain this damaging situation. It's damaging not only because of the risk, it's damaging to our military utility, and it's damaging to Britain's soft power and our reputation abroad, and it's damaging to the Union if you care about these things, because what's likely to happen is that Trident will be renewed. It will be renewed in Parliament next year. They will invest the £500 million that they promised a couple of weeks ago in the Scottish facilities. That will drive, particularly if we vote against membership of the EU in a year's time, that will drive independence. We will have a second independence referendum, and the very thing designed to protect the Union will actually destroy it, and then they'll have to sort out where these things go because they can't be based in Scotland. So there's a huge amount of folly in all of this. Or we put a much greater effort in disarmament, and that's not just doing the right thing and feeling comfortable about it. It's actually about prioritising how Britain provides leadership internationally in knocking heads together and driving international nuclear disarmament, because that matters far more than Trident, and seeing getting rid of Trident as a tool in that much more important, broader context. So I think what we need to be doing is reaching beyond the converted, and that means moving away from the traditional arguments against nuclear weapons, which are strong and which are relevant and powerful and important, recognising that other people don't necessarily have the same values or thought processes as we have had to come to this conclusion, but seeing that there is a major opportunity to reach into the minds and the framework within which people sit, and to realise that actually there is a strong and powerful security argument for getting rid of Trident.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Now we have fun and games of questions. I'm sure you've got tons of questions. And